Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This particular vlog is about hypnosis and logic. Hypnosis and logic, and how the logic of hypnosis reveals a truth about what we call psychological issues and addictions and psychosomatic issues. So I want to talk about three different types of logic and why being able to understand those distinctions and apply them strategically can really make a difference both in your life and in your client sessions. So one form of logic is either or logic. So something is either true or it's not. This type of either or logic is kind of the conventional logic that most of us seem to operate from a lot of the time. And it has its place. So, for example, if you and I were to have a conversation, and let's say that we have a mutual friend whose name is Mary, and let's say that I make the claim Mary is pregnant. Now, this is either true or it's not. So let's say that I think that Mary is pregnant, and you say Mary isn't pregnant. In this case, one of us is going to be right, and the other one is going to be wrong. So you're not going to be a little bit pregnant, right? You're either pregnant or you're not. Or if I say to you, Billy just died yesterday. Well, and let's say that you say, no, I saw him this morning. Well, in this particular case, one of us is going to be right and the other one is going to be wrong. Billy is either alive or he's dead, strictly biologically speaking. So either or logic has its place. It has its place when you work with, for example, objects, in the world of engineering, and just in the realm of objective fact. So, for example, let's say someone's been murdered and person A has been charged with that particular murder. Well, either he pulled the trigger and is the actual shooter, or he is not. So in this case, you're not really entitled to your opinion per se. It's either factually true or it's factually not true. However, there is another type of logic. There's two other types that I want to cover here, and they are both and logic, and they are and logic. So both and logic is something else entirely. So for example, one of my wife's favorite sayings is everything is relative. So she'll throw out this phrase, everything is relative. And I'll sometimes stop and say to her, is that relative? And usually she just rolls her eyes. Because if everything is relative, then the sentence or the notion, everything is relative, has to include itself. So per definition, not everything is relative. So this is a paradox. It's simultaneously true and untrue at the same time. A Danish physicist by the name of Niels Bohr, used to have a quote. I may not be paraphrasing him word by word here, but I'm getting the gist of it. He used to say that there are two types of truths. You have the shallow, simple truth, and you have the deeper truth. In the simple, shallow truth, the opposite of the truth claim is false. In the deeper truths, the opposite of the truth claim is equally true. So when you're working with hypnosis, you're in the realm of both and logic. And when you're working with what people call psychological issues, depression, anxiety, compulsions, these sorts of processes, you are also in the realm of both and logic. So I'll give you a fun example of this. I saw a client the other day And one of his issues was that whenever he leaned back in a chair, for example, and he looked to the right, he would get anxious and really dizzy. And he said to me, it's just so real. It's just so physical. So what I did with him was that I had him do a simple task where he took this tennis ball and he threw it back and forth between his hands. This kind of activates both hemispheres at the same time, and it gets your tasking network very active. And I had him do that and lean back in the chair and look to the right. And now he was no longer anxious or dizzy. And I had him alternate between this a few times, and suddenly he said exactly what I wanted him to say. He said, "Ha! When I do this, I'm not anxious at all." So he discovered that he could lean back in the chair, he could look to the right, and he wasn't anxious at all. And I said to him, "Why do you think that is?" And he said, "Well, I'm no longer thinking." I said, "That's right. You're no longer thinking." So his anxiety and his dizziness was real, but it had no existence outside of that particular thought. So it was real, but it had no existence outside of that particular thought. And this is true for the psychological issues that people bring in. They're real at the level of experience, but they really have no existence outside of the current thought stream. This is a matter of both and logic. So, for example, this particular client said to me, "Oh, but it's so physical. The anxiety and the dizziness, and it's just so physical." Now, there's a difference between the mind-body split is a myth to begin with, right? What we call mind and body is really an integrative system of processes. So this is fiction. But there is a difference. There are different types of physical. There's something being physical at the either-or level, and there's something being very physical at the both and level. And this is a gift of hypnosis. If you can help clients make that distinction and make that discovery, you're really opening the door for profound insights and change. I'll say it again. There is a difference between it's so physical at the either-or truth level, and it's so physical at the both and level of logic. So what I did with him is that I had him imagine his feet being stuck to the floor, and I guided him in such a way that was real to him. So when I had him try to move his feet, he was unable to do it. So he couldn't move his feet. Then I had him do the same thing with his arm, and I challenged him to move his arm, and he discovered that he couldn't do it. And this was completely real to him. Was it real? Yes. Was it complete BS? Yes. They're both simultaneously true. So I said to him, "Was that real to you? Like, how real was that to you?" And he said, "That was completely real. I really tried to move my feet and lift my feet, and I couldn't. I really tried to bend my arm, and I couldn't." Is it true? Yes. Is it simultaneously not true? Yes. So let's make a distinction between that hypnotic experience and let's say that, so I said to him, let's say that you were paralyzed from the waist down. Now, if you're paralyzed from the waist down and you're unable to move your feet, that's true in an either-or way, meaning it's true irrespective of the thinking process. So it's objectively true. If you're paralyzed from the waist down, then we can do hypnotic experiments all day long, and you're still going to be as paralyzed from the waist down. If you have the type of neurological damage that makes it so that you just can't send the signals to move your legs. So no matter what he were to believe, no matter what train of thought he were to be absorbed in, it would be equally true. So it's true, it's absolutely true, and it's objectively true. Now, when he had the hypnotic experience of not being able to move his feet, is it true? Yeah, it's psychologically true. It's true at the level of experience. He generally couldn't move his feet. But just like Niels Bohr said, it's equally untrue. It's not really true that he can't move his feet. Because as soon as he stopped being engaged in the thinking process that resulted in him not being able to move his feet, he could easily move his feet. So the truth or the experience had no reality independent of a current thought construct. This is so when most people talk about, when people are very anxious or very depressed or they have pain or they have psychosomatic issues, failing to make this very important distinction is largely what keeps them stuck, because they're applying either or logic to an experience which is true but has no truth outside of the current train of thought. Just as with the leaning back in the chair and being dizzy, it was true, but it was only true, as he discovered, as long as he was engaging in a particular train of thought. So when people do hypnosis, there's usually this both and logic going on. So for example, there's been these experiments done where you have people do what's called a negative hallucination. and I think it was Martin Orn who did these experiments. I'm using my memory here, so that may not be entirely correct, but I think it was Martin Orn who orchestrated them. And what they would do is that they would have these very highly hypnotizable folks, and they would have them negatively hallucinate a person standing in front of them, meaning not see the person, and then attempt to move from A to B. So the person standing in front of them was an obstacle to the chair that they were moving to. And the really interesting thing was, what's going to happen when people negatively hallucinate the person who's standing in the way. The really interesting part is that the highly hypnotizable folks would have a tendency to move around the person standing in their way while simultaneously swearing that they couldn't see the person. So they're moving around the person, clearly indicating that on some level they actually are seeing the person, but simultaneously claiming that they can't see the person. The low hypnotizables who can't do that phenomena of invisibility or negative hallucination, when they were asked to imagine it, or when people were asked to pretend, they have a tendency to just walk straight into the person in front of them as if they were blind. But the highly hypnotizable folks have a tendency not to do this. So this is a case of, it's probably true that at the level of experience they're not seeing the person, but simultaneously they kind of are. And that gives rise to this kind of paradoxical behavior. So again, there is a difference between not being able to see something or not having the experience of seeing something, as in a hypnotically suggested negative hallucination, and being blind. The person who's blind can't see, irrespective of, thinking process. Whereas the person who does the negative hallucination, that negative hallucination is real as a level of experience, but it really has no reality outside of that temporary thought construct. So if you can help a client make this discovery that there's a difference between the it's so physical at the level of either or logic, for example, the person is paralyzed or blind, and the it's so real, it's so physical at the level of pain or allergy or anxiety and depression, where they can realize that, yeah, it's real, but it has no reality outside of that particular thought construct. Then, as I said previously, you're often really able to open a door to some profound change. When you think about it, and this is what I point to in my psychological illusion model, when people experience psychological suffering, they are thinking, or more accurately, thoughts are appearing, and they're not seen as thoughts. So it's thoughts unseen that really makes it seem as if whatever we're thinking is completely real, and that we are identical with that thinking, and that we are the thinker of that thinking. This is the psychological illusion at play. Thoughts appearing, and the thoughts are unseen, meaning they're not seen as thoughts. So my job as an agent of change is to help people increase their level of insight and to increase their capacity to see thoughts as thoughts. Now take a look at hypnosis. Hypnosis really is an activity, well, really is, but it really is an activity where one person is guiding another person to have particular thought constructs, particular emotions, particular experiences, and to then not quite see that they're doing that, to then kind of interpret or forget or not quite know that it's a thought construct, and therefore it seems real, and therefore it very often seems as if the hypnotist is the source of the experience and is making them feel whatever they're feeling. This is an illusion. So this is a very, very interesting variable to play with. If you get skilled at working with hypnotic phenomena with people and to help them kind of make these discoveries and play with that variable of seeing thoughts as thoughts or not seeing thoughts as thoughts, that's gold. Hypnosis is largely a paradox in a sense. As Jay Haley pointed out, when you're doing hypnosis with someone, you're inviting them to engage in a paradoxical experience. You're directing them to behave spontaneously. That's a paradox. You're directing someone to behave spontaneously. So the hypnotist may say, in a few seconds, that left arm is going to lift. Now, this is kind of a paradox because the hypnotist is on the one level saying, I want you to lift your hand, but simultaneously he's saying, I don't want you to do it. So a solution to this is, of course, to lift it and to think it, but to simultaneously interpret the experience as non-volitional, simultaneously kind of forgetting that that's what's taking place, which gives rise to the experience of a non-volitional lifting arm of, oh shit, that's weird, I'm not doing it, the hypnotist is powerful, he made me do it. There's a final type of logic here too, and that is and logic. So as the philosopher Ken Wilber has often pointed out, every way of understanding is simultaneously a way of not understanding, or any way of knowing is simultaneously a way of not knowing, because that particular way of knowing is based upon certain assumptions, which per definition includes something and excludes other things. So, and logic kind of operates under the presumption that, yeah, this is one perspective, or this may be true, but it's partially true. So there's the and logic of, what else is also true? So you have this, and you have this, and you have this. Stephen Gilligan has very often made what I think is an excellent point, and I kind of got this from Milton Erickson, but it's his kind of wording, where he would say that the problem is not the problem. The problem is that what's called the problem lives in isolation from other truths and other perspectives. So studying psychopathology, I don't like pathology because it's bullshit, but studying psychopathology is in some ways the study of loneliness, meaning the person has one perspective. And the perspective may have some truth claim to it, but it's isolated from other truth claims and other perspectives. So I may have a client, for example, a woman who's been raped, and she develops the notion that all men are dangerous. They're all obsessed with one thing, and you can't trust them. Now, is this true? Is this true? No, but it's a partial truth. It has some truth validity to it, meaning that some men in some contexts are dangerous. Some men in some contexts will rape you, given the chance. But it's isolated from the perspective that there's a lot of men in a lot of contexts who won't do that. So what you're looking to do very often in hypnotic work is to play with the both and logic and to play with the and logic, where you can expand upon perspectives. And you can train someone to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously and thereby have a richer model of the world. Let me give you a final example of this, but before, this may sound very abstract and very theoretical. So there's a philosopher by the name of Ken Wilber, who I just mentioned, so he popped back up into my mind. And he has this 4-quadrant model, where he talks about the upper right, the lower right, the upper left, and the lower left. So the upper right is about objective truth. So let's say we're studying human beings. So at the upper right quadrant, you would study the brain like they do in neuroscience. You would study behaviors. You would, from like a third-person scientific perspective, study the brain or study particular behaviors. The upper left is internal subjective experience. So you can study the upper right, the brain as an organ, all day long, but it doesn't necessarily tell you that much about what someone's actual internal experience is. So if you study meditation, or you study neuro-linguistic programming, or you play with hypnotic phenomena, this is a chance to study internal psychological experience, so to speak. You have the lower right, where you study its, meaning, infrastructure, birth rates, political systems per se. So the objective kind of its, right? And then you have the lower left, which is a study of, cultural norms and language and kind of like shared interpersonal, intersubjective experience. Now, most people have a tendency to be quadrant absolutists, meaning if they study a particular topic, they're going to reduce the complexity of it to one quadrant. So, for example, if you talk to someone who may be very spiritually inclined, and you talk about the human experience, they may reduce everything to the upper left. It's all a thought construct per se. If you talk to someone who is very much into nutrition, for example, or they may say, it's all a biochemical, imbalance or something like that. Or a sociologist may say, it's all culture, it's all made up, it's all based in language and social norms. And a Marxist, for example, may, well, there's no reason to take Marxists seriously, but a Marxist might say, it's all class and it's all based upon economics, essentially. So let's say, for example, that you were to study consciousness. You could attempt to study consciousness looking at the brain as an organ. You could also study consciousness upper left by doing meditation and doing experiments in consciousness, so to speak. You could study the correlation between, particular living conditions or economic systems and how people's experience of life seems to be correlated. Like, for example, someone who studies spiral dynamics or Marxism or something like that. Or you could study culture and look at how different cultures give rise to very different experiences in people. So if you take, for example, the topic of heart disease, in our Western culture, we have studied a lot about alcohol and nutrition and sugar and smoking, and seeing that these are factors in the development of heart disease. But if you study the upper left, you'll find correlations between feelings of hostility, chronic anger, loneliness, depression. These are also factors. If you study culture, you could look up the Rosetta story, for example, and you'll notice that in certain communities where people are very, tight-knit, have strong social bonds and social rituals, their levels of heart disease seem to be much lower. And you could study, for example, economic systems and political systems and see that the rates may be higher or lower and that there are correlations there too. So that would be an example of and logic, So if you, for example, say that, hostility and chronic anger and loneliness, may be a factor, someone who only looks at the upper right might say, no, it's all about smoking and diet and exercise, for example. You may both be right. This is a case of like and logic, where you might go, yeah, this has some truth, and this has some truth, and this has some truth, and this has some truth. So anyways, before I start rambling too much, there's one more thing I wanted to pick up here. So with this particular client who had the anxiety and who made the complaint that it's so physical and therefore it's so real, I had him, we played with some more hypnotic phenomena, and I had him not be able to remember his name. So his name was John. And I had him imagine that his name was in my pocket in such a way that he couldn't access it. He got completely flustered, his face kind of flushed. And he said, Tom, So he actually said the wrong name, and he couldn't access his own name. Once again, this was true. It was completely true. But as soon as the name came out of my pocket and was back into his head, he could say John again. So it was true at a both and level of truth. So I looked at him and I said, if you were to get yourself stuck in that anxious loop for a little while, if something like that were to happen, I want you to stop and say to yourself, Tom, what have you gotten yourself into? And he thought this was extremely funny because, of course, his name was not Tom. But by tasking him with saying out loud to himself, Tom, what on earth have you gotten yourself stuck into? Well, it kind of reminds him of that fun hypnotic experiment where he made a discovery about not only his own mind, but about the human mind in general. So a lot of food for thought here. I hope this was inspiring. I hope it may spark some creativity in you in doing some experiments. Anyways, till next